About 2 years ago, I built my first tub system specifically designed for monitor lizards. It has proven to be a very effective system of raising hatchlings. I haven't had a single hatchling escape from this rack, and I really like most of the features that I have incorporated. But with more hatchlings on the way, I'll need something bigger, so this new rack that I'll be building will have 4 levels, housing 12 tubs in total. An essential component of the hatchling rack is the screen top, so that's where I'll start. The screen top is what separates this rack from most of the reptile racks out there. It allows plenty of ventilation so I can have very hot basking spots without overheating the tubs. It also allows me to use basking lamps and UV lights for the inhabitants. The screen top is made almost entirely out of aluminium, so it's waterproof and heat resistant. Using stop blocks and guide fences, I'm able to cut and drill multiple pieces that will make up the screen tops precisely at the exact same length and holes at the exact same positions. When building something like a rack that has repeating parts, it is important to have a system like this that ensures all the repeating parts come out identical after assembly. Sometimes even careful measuring and marking is not enough. Once all the square aluminium pieces were cut to length and drilled, I printed some ABS plastic connectors for joining them together. The assembly for this quick connect system is easy. All I needed was to tap everything together using a rubber mallet, but it is not very structurally sound by itself. That was one problem I had with my first rack that I'm hoping to rectify in this build. The screen itself is an aluminium expanded mesh. I chose a size with holes that are big enough for good ventilation and for light to pass through, but not large enough for the lizard's heads and arms to stick through. I cut them down to match the size of the aluminium frames using a pair of tin snips. To secure the screen to the frame, I cut some 1.2 by 25mm aluminium flat bars to the length that would surround the perimeter of the screen. Multiple holes were drilled, and everything was fastened together using blind rivets. I made sure to also fasten the middle of the aluminium screen so that lizards can't squeeze through to get across to the next tubs. The rest of the rack is made out of 30-30 aluminium T-slot extrusions. I think the 30 series is the minimum size I would go for if built this size. The 20 series T-slot will probably bend a bit under stress. I started by cutting everything to length. Again using stop blocks wherever I needed multiple pieces cut at the same length. Some of the T-slots only have slots on 3 sides, leaving one side flat. These are the ones that I've selected to use at the front of the rack for aesthetic reasons. The holes that I drilled earlier in the aluminium square tubes allowed the T-slot aluminium to be attached to the front and back of the screen tops using some bolts and T-nuts. The holes were strategically drilled to be a millimeter or two larger than the diameter of the bolts so that there will be some wiggle room for finer readjustments. The purpose of the T-slot aluminium is to reinforce the screen top, taking the strain off the plastic connectors, which were the weakest points of the frame. The T-slot aluminium is also how the screen tops are going to be attached to the rest of the rack. To prevent lizards from wedging themselves in the T-slots, plastic cover slips were installed into all the T-slots that were facing the tubs. Because this rack will not have any side walls to hold the tubs in, I installed some guide rails using the remaining aluminium flat bars to keep the tubs in position when sliding them in and out. Once that was done, the screen tops for the rack are completed. The 4 longest lengths of T-slot aluminium make up the 4 upright legs of the rack. They were tapped with an M8 thread to allow rubber feet to be used. When tapping, I used WD-40 as my lubricant and made sure to do a quarter turn anti-clockwise every now and then to avoid the metal from binding. Moving on to making the shelves for the rack where the tubs will be sitting on, I started by making this 3D printed jig that fastens onto the T-slot aluminium to allow me to drill holes perfectly perpendicular at the desired locations. These holes that I have drilled will allow the T-slot aluminium to be assembled using bolts in a later step. But before assembling the shelves, some 8mm polycarbonate twin wall panel were cut to size so that they can be incorporated into the shelves. The corners of the panels had to be trimmed off so it doesn't get in the way of the hardware that will be holding the aluminium together. Each shelf is basically an aluminium frame with 2 polycarbonate panels enclosed within. The front side of the frame is held together using iron brackets and grub screws, whereas the back side is being held together by the bolts and threads that I have prepared earlier. The bolts are tightened through the holes that I have drilled earlier using my jig. With all the major components of this rack completed, it is time to assemble everything together. It involved sliding the screen tops and shelves into the 4 upright pieces in an alternating order. At this point, it is not important to get everything in the perfect position, as I will come back to fine-tune everything later. The rack was also beefed up using some 3060 aluminium profile and some L-shaped brackets to prevent any rocking and wobble. back of the rack was made of a single sheet of aluminium composite panel in a brushed metal finish. To make it easier to install, I attached some scrap aluminium to the base of the rack, so the aluminium composite panel had something to rest up against while I secured it to the frame using some T-nuts and bolts. The surface of each shelf will be made out of 2mm thick aluminium sheets. This will allow me to hide the heat mats beneath the aluminium so that the tubs will slide in and out on a smooth, unobstructed surface, but the aluminium will still carry heat from beneath to heat the tubs up gently from underneath. A circular saw with a high tooth count general purpose saw blade worked well for cutting this aluminium sheet. I just had to go at a slow but consistent speed. The freshly cut aluminium edges were a bit sharp, so I sanded the edges to a round finish. I also drilled some holes along the edges of the aluminium sheet, where I will later use for attaching them onto the frame of the shelves. The aluminium sheets were temporarily placed into the rack so I can fine-tune the heights of each shelf. This part was one of the most fiddly and annoying parts of the build. I had to adjust things multiple times just to get the position right, so that the tubs slide smoothly but without much of a gap between the top of the tubs and the screen tops. I also had to make sure that the shelves and the screen tops still stayed square relative to the frame after the whole adjusting process. What really helped in this process were these scrap aluminium pieces that helped me space things apart at a consistent distance. Within each shelf, between the polycarbonate twin wall panels and the aluminium sheet, there is a 1 cm gap that I filled using insulation foam. This insulation foam will not only help direct more heat from the heat mat upwards towards the tubs, but also prevent the heat from the level below affecting the level above, which can be an issue on hotter days. For the heat mats, I used underfloor carbon heat films. I have covered how to make heat mats out of them in a separate video. A hole was drilled in the corner of the shelves to allow a cable to pass through. Once the wiring and the electrical insulation were completed, the aluminium sheet could be installed. The insulation foam is soft and compressible enough that the wiring of the heat mats will just sink into the foam once the aluminium sheets were tightened down onto the frame. The aluminium sheets were secured also using T-nuts and bolts. To bring electricity supply to the heat mats in each shelf without too many cables hanging around, I decided to install a series of quick connect plug bases. I also 3D printed a cover to go over the plugs so it looks less bare. In the end, I decided not to have any built-in permanent electrical outlets and wiring for the lighting, so I can keep things flexible and modular. So that's the end of this build. The overall aesthetics of this rack is a bit different to my usual style. It has more of an industrial look, but I like it. The open frame and taller spacing between each level allows even more ventilation than the previous rack, so I won't have to worry about overheating as much. If it gets too hot in summer, I can still install some computer fans to each tub, like how I did with my first rack. Regardless, now that I have a larger rack with more tubs, I think I'm ready for the next breeding season.